Penny. All right, I'm making you a little video so that you can do this at home. So, I measured, I'll give you the amounts on a piece of paper so you'll have that by now. Here's yours. I use a digital scale for these measurements, and I'll tell you how to get that later. Basically, you can go to Bed Bath & Beyond or Home or Walmart, any of those stores, and get like a digital scale. So I weighed out the amounts. Again, this is I do it in 2 parts when I do whole wheat. I do 963 grams of white flour and 456 grams of whole wheat flour, but right now we're just using strictly white, so that's the amount I measured. There's the flour. All right, we have our starter here, and I'm just gonna add water. And I do it by feel to get the correct texture, so...
Oh, that's drinking water.
Yeah. Honey, who's doing this, me or you?
No, I'll do my...
Okay, thank you, got it. Okay, so...
Whoa!
So I'm just gonna add it until I get the consistency I like for the dough. It's gonna be similar to probably the consistency you do for chapati. If am I saying the word right? Yes. Okay.
Daddy, you're the best.
Yeah, oh, thank you. And so what we're doing now is we're not mixing the salt yet. All we want to do is, this is called auto-leasing. We're wetting it and mixing the dough with the flour with the water, and we're gonna let it sit for 1 hour. And that's gonna auto-lease or pre-digest. So it's gonna let the flour start to pre-digest with the enzymes that are already found there. After we finish this, we're gonna weigh out our starter, and I'm gonna add some flour to that so it's not overly wet and doesn't affect the consistency of the dough when I do 1 hour from now incorporate the sour starter with the dough, so it keeps the texture the right amount of water. You could probably cut it for now until I finish mixing it. Okay, so what I've done is I've measured out 485 grams of starter. Essentially the ratio is 1 part starter, 2 parts, I believe, water, and 3 parts flour. So there's the but I have a recipe I'll give you that you'll have. But 485 that. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna add, if you look, the starter is always more wet because it's easier to manage and wetter. But it's so wet that if we add it to our dough, it's gonna be too wet. So what we're gonna do is all we're simply doing is adding some flour to this on the side while that auto-leases, so that this isn't so wet that it affects our texture of our dough. So that's all I'm doing. I'm just gonna add some flour to get the texture of this approximately the same as this. In an hour, we're gonna combine the salt, the starter mix, and this. The other advantage of doing it this way is I'm feeding again the starter, and again I'm revving up the production of the bacteria that's gonna leaven the dough. So I'm feeding it ahead of time, which gives us some more momentum and helps to save time later. So I'm just mixing this in. And again, the objective is just to get this the same texture as that. That's all. And it's the starter mixed with flour. So you can cut it. Okay, so I'm done mixing the fresh flour in with the old starter. And I've made it the same or close to the same consistency as our fresh batch of dough. This is gonna be, so when we combine this new flour and water with the old starter, And again, an hour later, after it's pre-digested or auto-released, we're gonna add salt. Then we'll finally add our salt. The reason we don't add our salt is because if you put salt in at first, the salt's gonna regulate the way the enzymes behave, and you lose that pre-digestion phase that brings some of the extra flavor out. So we're gonna, an hour from now, we'll combine the salt, the starter, and this, and then we'll have our full dough. So now we're gonna complete the cycle. If you remember, we started out with, this is the old sourdough starter. So all we're gonna do is we're gonna bring the cycle to a completion by, again, feeding the starter, because we took some out to make the dough. So now we're just making sure we have enough starter to continue going indefinitely. So now we're gonna feed the starter again with some fresh flour. And the starter I like to keep a little more wet than a batch of dough, because it's easier to mix and handle, and you don't have to get it all stuck on your hands, and you can always add more flour later, but it's just easier to work with as a more wet dough. So I'm just gonna add some flour and water. I'm gonna stir this in. I'm gonna cover it and put it back in the fridge until the next time I'm making bread again. And that completes the cycle. And there'll be more later, whether you're here or on video, to show you where we go from there. We're gonna, after these mix, we're gonna let it double in size. Then we will smash out all the gas, and we'll cut it into 3 even loaves, and we will let that rest so that the gluten, the protein that makes it stretch, can relax. Then we'll shape it, and we'll put it into the bread pans, the loaf, for proofing. It'll double in size one last time. We'll score it and bake it. So, okay, so now I'm gonna mix the salt, the fresh flour and water with the old starter that we adjusted earlier. Then mix it together and make a dough ball. So, and this will start the fermentation for our bread that we're making. We'll mix in the salt so it's spread evenly. And then I'm gonna take it out and knead it on the table. Again, this is just like making chapati. I'm just making dough. Now I got the salt mixed in. Scrape the bowl out, get all that good stuff. I'm just gonna turn it out using my heel, pressing into the dough. Get everything mixed evenly. You knead it until, usually you have to knead it for about 7 to 12 minutes. And you'll know when to stop because it's elastic and smooth. And this is something you have to do and get a feel for. So just every time you make a batch, you want to pay attention to how it feels, how firm it is, and pay attention how the outcome happens, how it is in the end. If you over knead it, it becomes mealy. And if you under knead it, the gluten won't be developed enough and it won't stretch and be as elastic as it needs to be. But if you made chapati before, again, you know what the dough should feel like when it's done. If you have a dough mixer, you can use the dough hook and you don't have to do this. So I just keep pressing my way into it. And once it gets long, I'll fold it back on itself. Notice how it's getting long. So I'll just take it and fold it back on itself. And start again. I'm using the weight of my heel and all my body weight to press into it. So right now I can still feel the salt grains in there, so it hasn't completely dissolved and been absorbed in. That's another clue, I'm not done yet. And right now, the old starter is beginning to mix with the new flour and water, and start ferment. So once we're done with this, it will begin the stage of bulk fermentation. We'll make it into a dough ball, and it's going to need to double in size before our next step. How long it takes to proof will vary on the temperature of the room. If it's really warm, it'll ferment quickly, maybe 4 or 5 hours. If it's cooler, say like 68 degrees in your house, it could take as long as 8 hours to ferment for this stage. We're going to try to keep it warm so it happens more quickly. And that's another thing you'll get a feel for the more you do it. How long it'll take based on the activity level of your starter. The more active your starter is, and the faster it's already fermenting, the faster your dough will proof as well. It's another factor. If you want to increase the speed that your starter is proofing, more frequent feedings, keep it warm. If you want to slow down the speed that your starter is reproducing at, keep it cool and feed it less often. And that will slow the proofing method. There are some advantages to going slower. Namely, you get more of a sour flavor to your dough. So a longer proof method, say with cold water, a cool room temperature, when you mix it and then refrigerate your dough and proof it in the fridge, you can make it take between 1 and 2 days long just to proof. And by doing so, it'll get more sour if you like that sour flavor. But a warmer temperature, it tends to be much less sour. It's getting very close to being finished. It feels there's a continuity throughout the dough. It feels the same in all spots. So I know we're getting really close. When you pinch it, you'll notice the texture. And so now all we're gonna do is make a dough ball, let it begin the bulk fermentation. We're gonna note what size it is, and we're waiting for it to double. So I'm just shaping it into a dough ball, round, so I can tell how big it is, and we'll be done with this stage. So we'll just cover this. If you notice, it hasn't taken up the space on the sides, and it's not domed up. By the time it's doubled, it'll pretty much fill this bowl, and it'll be a little rounded up on the top. It'll be breaking the surface, and it'll fill that space. Then it'll be ready for the next step.